Hello, I'm Dr. Trent Stevens. I am a distinguished emeritus faculty in anatomy and embryology at Idaho State University in Pocatello, Idaho. I'm going to be giving you a series of lectures from my gross anatomy course, which is Biology 540. This is a graduate level course for dental students in our program. And I'll talk more about that program in just a moment. I'm going to go to my screen share so I can bring up the course. Bring myself down a bit and go to my PowerPoint. All right, as I said, this is human gross anatomy. It's listed at Idaho State University as BIOS 540. This is lecture 1A, an introduction. Now, even though this is a graduate level course, the lectures I'm going to be giving on this video, on this and the following videos, I think are lectures that are appropriate for students between the ages of 10 and 100. I think younger students can benefit from this course, especially the way I teach it, and people who are retired and want to expand their minds and continue to learn can benefit from this as well. I've been preparing this series of lectures for over 40 years as I've been teaching anatomy. I am Dr. Trent D. Stevens, and there's a lot of misconception about the word doctor. We saw that especially with the First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, as people were castigating her for using the name doctor when they thought doctor meant a physician. Well, it doesn't. Doctor is Middle English, taken from Old French, and ultimately from Latin. Doctor means a teacher, and it's from docere, which means to teach. So if you're a doctor, you need to be a teacher. Unfortunately, medical doctors have usurped the term. If medical doctors are teaching in medical school or some other setting, then they are indeed a doctor. If they're not, if they are your general practitioners to whom you go for medical issues, there are physicians. And the word doctor means to teach. So Dr. Jill Biden, who has a PhD in education, as I believe, is truly a doctor, as am I, I have a PhD in anatomy, and I have been teaching for nearly 50 years. I have 3 websites that I want to bring your attention to. My main website is trentdstevens.com. There you will find not only the series of videoed lectures that I'm giving, but also a number of blogs. It features several of the books that I've written, including books on religion and science. I also am a fan of castles. I have visited castles all over the world and have created model castles of many of the castles that I visited. Those are at buildmodelcastles.com. And I've also designed components for parties that you can print off, cut out, and put together and make your own party supplies. I've been teaching for nearly 50 years, starting with teaching developmental biology when I was working on my master's degree. And I've been teaching anatomy for 45 years. I grew up in South Central Idaho. I attended Raft River High School in Malta, Idaho, where I graduated in 1966. As you can see, that makes me pretty old. I've been around for a long time. I have a bachelor's degree in both microbiology and a bachelor's degree in zoology from Brigham Young University in 1973. And at that time, I began teaching the developmental biology labs at BYU. I received a master's degree in zoology from BYU in 1974, and then went to the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, where I received a PhD in anatomy in 1977. After that, I went to the University of Washington Medical School from 1977 to 1981, where I did a postdoc in pediatrics. And at that point, I started teaching human gross anatomy. I was hired to teach a very large undergraduate anatomy course at the University of Washington. There were about 350 students in that course. I taught that for 3 years. And then for a couple of years, I also taught in the medical school and helped teach in the course on musculoskeletal anatomy to the medical students. Then in 1981, I was hired at Idaho State University as a, first of all, an assistant professor of anatomy and embryology, and ultimately a full professor. And now I'm emeritus, a distinguished emeritus professor, having retired about 11 years ago in 2011. And I still continue to teach anatomy at Idaho State University to the dental students. So I have done since 1981 and continue to teach human gross anatomy in the Idaho Dental Education Program, the IDEP program, which is for dental students. The dental students here take their first year at Idaho State University, including courses that I teach. I at one time was teaching 4 different classes to the dental students, and now I only teach 1 after my retirement. And then they transfer to Creighton University, with which we're affiliated, and I'm a retired affiliate professor at Creighton. And for their last 3 years, and they graduate from Creighton University with a Doctor of Dental Sciences. The course that I teach, gross anatomy, is the same series of lectures that I would be teaching if I were teaching in a medical school. And I've had the experience in both taking anatomy in a medical school and teaching anatomy in a medical school. I'd like to talk about some of the books that I recommend for students in gross anatomy. And these can all be purchased online. The first is a textbook this is the most popular textbook in both dental schools and medical schools around the country. This is a book by Keith Moore, Clinically Oriented Anatomy. Keith retired a number of years ago, and Art Daly, who was also from Idaho originally, has taken over as the main author of this textbook. The other textbook that is very popular and I highly recommend is what I would call the Bible of Anatomy, Gray's Anatomy, which was first published around 1858. It's into its like 30th edition. At one point, the British English edition separated from the American English edition of the book. And so there's 2 different editions. I think the English edition is like 1 edition ahead or 2 editions ahead. It not only contains gross anatomy, but it also contains neuroanatomy and histology and embryology. So it's a very comprehensive book covering a number of different anatomy courses. I highly recommend this for anybody interested in anatomy. Not only that, it makes a very impressive addition to your bookshelf, being a very hefty book. This one's a beautifully bound. You can get a paperback of this for about $5 online. Another way to go in anatomy textbooks are the anatomy and physiology textbooks that are written, designed for students in undergraduate courses in either anatomy or anatomy and physiology. The one on your left, as you can see, is the 8th edition of the textbook that I co-authored with Rod Seeley and Phil Tate. We wrote that textbook for 25 years. The reason that it's a good enough textbook that can be used for even medical school and dental school classes is that the anatomy material in there is very complete and quite above the level that's actually needed for most anatomy and physiology courses at the undergraduate level. About 12 years or so ago, we retired from writing that book and turned it over to, as you can see, 3 other authors who have taken over the book. And it's now called Seeley's Anatomy and Physiology. We still receive residual royalties from that textbook, but really don't have any, they're not involved now in actually any of the revisions. For any student of anatomy or any of the other medical sciences for that matter, I highly recommend Stedman's Medical Dictionary. There are several medical dictionaries around. I prefer Stedman's. It's very, very useful in terms of looking up medical, including anatomical terms. It's my goal to never introduce an anatomical term without defining it. And in terms of the original etymology of the term. So Stedman's includes the etymology, which is the origin of the word, that is a Latin or is a Greek originally, and what the original meaning was for the term. And I'll give you some examples in just a moment of that. It's interesting that in Stedman's dictionary, the authors in the first pages of the book say that we really don't know how the words were pronounced in the original Greek or Latin. So we kind of pronounce them by tradition. And as a result, pronunciation differs from place to place and from person to person. Just as an example, here in the United States, we talk about the skeletal system, but in England, they talk about the skeletal system. So just very basic things like that, very basic anatomical terms are pronounced quite differently on the 2 sides of the Atlantic. I also strongly recommend an atlas of human anatomy. The dental students that I teach have 2 labs a week. Actually, the way I'm teaching it now, there are 5 labs a week because it's more of a compressed course. They would actually do dissections of cadavers using an atlas as a guide. This isn't my favorite anatomy atlas. Grant's atlas is my favorite, but this is the most popular one. It's a clinical atlas of human anatomy, and it's actually based on photographs. And I will use photographs in some of my lecture slides as I go along. This brings us to the definition of one of the words that we use, that is anatomy, which means to cut apart. Ana means apart, and tomi is to cut. And so just basic definitions, even of that term which we usually most people are quite familiar with. Anatomy is actually 2 foreign languages. The words are either Latin or Greek or Latinized Greek. And so one of the things that has really surprised me is that a lot of anatomy, or most anatomy courses, in fact, don't teach what the original words mean. And so students are learning the names of structures, of anatomical structures, without even knowing what the word means. And it seems to me kind of counterintuitive that you would learn a foreign language without knowing what the words actually mean. You're applying them to structures without knowing their meaning. So here's a little snippet, a mini course on how to earn an A in anatomy. I've looked at other YouTube videos entitled How to Get an A in Anatomy, and they emphasize that you need to spend a lot of time. There's a lot of memorization in anatomy. I agree with all of that. However, none of those other videos mention that you need to learn what the words actually mean. Now, in my opinion, the key to getting an A in anatomy is knowing what the terminology means. I teach 8 students. We have the luxury of having 8 dental students here for their first year of dental school. And I love teaching that small number. I teach them in August in 3 weeks. I refer to it as anatomy by fire hose because they're meeting 5 days a week, 8 hours a day to take gross anatomy. And these are very, very outstanding students. A few years ago, one of my students said to me, did you know that it was harder to get into the Idaho Dental Education Program than it is to get into Harvard Dental School? He said that particular year, at least, the Harvard Dental School accepted 12% of their applicants. And that the same year, the IDEP program accepted 10% of the applicants. So we have a very, very select group of students. They're very highly motivated, they're very good students. And last August, the last course I taught, the final average for the entire course was 97.5. These are very high achieving students, but at the same time, I think one of the reasons that they all scored so high is that I really emphasize that you know what the words mean, so that you own the words and not just have them as labels on pictures. Here's an example. I can take a human skull and I can hold it in my hand and look at the inferior surface. Inferior means the bottom, or means below. And I feel like Hamlet holding York's skull and saying, alas, poor York, I knew him. And I don't know any of these people whose skulls I hold. But we can look at this skull and we see this great big huge hole toward the posterior part of the skull, which the word posterior means that which follows. It's a movement statement. And that big hole, whoops, a little bit too far forward, is called the foramen magnum. Well, foramen means hole and magnum means big. And so the foramen magnum is just the big hole. Well, you can look at the skull and you can say, well, that's a big hole, and you don't need me to teach you anatomy. You can learn it yourself if you just know what the words mean. Now you can see that there are other holes around in this skull, and all of them are foramina. That's plural for foramen. So whenever you see the word foramen, you know that that is means a hole. For example, this one right here is called the foramen ovale, which means it's an oval hole. Well, it describes it perfectly. And the foramen magnum is the big hole. So anytime you see the word foramen, now you know that that means hole. Anytime you see magnum, you know that means big. Now I'm going to spend some time, the rest of the time today, in this lecture, talking about the history of anatomy. And the reason I'm doing that is that we need to gain an appreciation for where the words come from. Many of the words we use in anatomy are 4,000 or 5,000 years old. And we use them in spite of the fact that even today we recognize that they're not accurate. That these words mean something to the original people who coined the terms, but we know that that's not what the term means today. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that as we go along. Now, it's important to understand that anatomy has a very strong Western bias, and really what that it means is a Greco-Roman bias. We really don't pay much attention, or any attention for that matter, to the Far East, into the advances made in medicine that was going on in the Far East. Chinese, Japanese anatomy and medicine didn't have any influence really on the terminology that we use today. That terminology came originally from, a lot of it from Egypt, and then from Greece and from Rome to medieval Europe. So we're going to talk about the history of anatomy as being in 4 periods. We'll start with the Egyptian period, which was approximately, I'm going to define it as 2500 BC to about 600 BC. The Greek period, we can call it the Greco-Roman period, from about 600 BC to 201 AD, which is a specific date, and I'll explain that in a minute. The medieval period from 201 to 1543 AD, another very specific date. The medieval period can be broken down into 2 sub periods: the Dark Ages from 201 AD to 900 AD, and what we in anatomy call the Scholastic period from 900 to 1543 AD. And then lastly, we have the modern era, which began in 1543 and is continuing on to the present time. So if we look at the Egyptian period, and we look at all of the splendor and the art and the literature that comes out of that Egyptian period, mummification was a very, very big part of the Egyptian tradition. And the anatomy that we have coming out of the Egyptian period really comes primarily from the process of mummification. Now, in order to have a mummy preserved like the one you see in this picture, you're really looking at dehydration. That's the main process. And what you want to do is get rid of anything that is fluid. So you want to drain out as much blood as you can, and you want to get rid of the organs inside the body, which are very fluid in nature. This is a mural from a reproduction of a mural from a tomb showing the part of the mummification process. Here we have 2 images. In the upper left is an image from the Egyptian time, and in the right is a more modern depiction of mummification. Now, one of the problems that we have with mummification is expressed here in the Bible or Torah in Numbers chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. And it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Command the children of Israel that they put out of the camp every leper and every one that hath an issue." Now, that means an issue of blood, such as menstrual blood. It doesn't mean people that have issues with the leaders. "And whosoever is defiled by the dead." Now, that last statement is important to understand when it comes to anatomy. If you are in the room with a dead person, you are being defiled by that dead person. And in Numbers, it says that you're to be put outside of the camp. And in more extreme cases, you actually could be stoned to death by being defiled by a dead body. Now, the Egyptians had this. So here we have this in Numbers. A lot of what we have from the Israelite Hebrew scriptures comes from traditions that they picked up while they were in Egypt. And the Egyptians had the same concept, that if you were defiled by a body, that was a capital sin, and you could be executed by stoning. Now, here you see 2 priests who are embalming a cadaver. One of them has cut a slit in the lower right abdomen of the cadaver, and is sticking his hand inside. And basically what he's doing is pulling out the internal organs, those organs that have fluid associated with them, so that you can embalm the cadaver. The problem is now he's very defiled by that cadaver. So according to law, he needs to be stoned. Well, if you stoned to death every priest that was involved in embalming, you would very soon run out of priests, and embalming would be a problem. So how did they solve this? They solved it by abiding by the letter of the law, and that is they were stoned, but they used little tiny stones. So they would chase the priest around the room and throw little bitty stones at him, and that accomplished the letter of the law. So now if we go back to this larger picture, what we see here over on the right-hand side are what are called canopic jars. And those jars, here's a photograph of 4 jars that have come out of a tomb. They contain within them the intestine, the stomach, the liver, and the lungs of the person who was embalmed. So as this priest reached inside, he pulled out these internal organs. And you had to know quite a bit of anatomy to be able to pull out these organs. For example, to get to the lungs, you're going to have to cut through the diaphragm. And so these priests needed to know that kind of information. What's really interesting about these 4 canopic jars is not only what's in them, but what isn't in them. What's missing from here? Well, what's missing from these canopic jars is the heart, which was left in the body, and the brain, which was discarded. Now, the heart was left in the body for a couple of reasons. One was a practical reason, and that is, even though the heart contains blood, it's a muscle, and it's not inherently that liquid, and so it can be dehydrated like the rest of the muscles of the body. The other reason it was left in the heart is because it was the most important organ to the individual, to that mummy. It was the brain. It was the seat of love, of loyalty, of courage. All those good qualities that a person has were thought to be in the heart, and so therefore the heart was left in the body. Well, that didn't leave anything for the brain to do. In fact, the Egyptians thought that the brain was part of the cooling system of the body, and therefore they simply discarded it. During the mummification process, they would go up through the nose and break through what's called the cribriform plate, which is deep in the nose between the eyes. And the word cribriform means that it's shaped like a sieve. So a sieve has holes in it. There's a whole bunch of foramina in the cribriform plate. And the Egyptians thought that those holes were for the brain to drain out into the nose. So if you became very hot, like for example, if you had a cold and you had a fever, your brain would become overheated and would liquefy and run out through your nose. And thus you have the phlegm that you blow out of your nose. Not only that, from a practical perspective, if you're embalming somebody in the Valley of the Kings and it's 120 degrees outside, the brain may be fairly liquefied already. So you simply go through the cribriform plate, take it out and throw it away. Well, I hate to burst anyone's bubble, but that means that movies like The Mummy are fantasies. If you didn't know that, I'm telling you now. Because if you have a mummy come back to life, which the Egyptians thought that they would, there's one major problem. They don't have a brain. So they're going to run around running into doors and not be very intelligent. And you're not going to be chased down by the mummies, the zombies. They're going to be pretty inefficient, immobile, and you should be able to escape them fairly easily. Well, here is a set of mummification tools taken from one of the preparation rooms where mummies were prepared. And you can see right in the center here is a spoon-like device with a point on it. And this was the device used to go through the cribriform plate and ladle out the brain and discard it. So it wasn't saved. Unfortunately for the mummies, when they come back alive, it's the one thing that they needed that they didn't have preserved. Now, so what we see then is that in the Egyptian period, because of this mummification process, we have a lot of knowledge that's kind of obscure knowledge that was unique to the priests. They didn't share it. And a lot of our terminology that we have in anatomy, we can trace all the way back to the Egyptians 4,000 years ago. Well, that led then to the Greek period, or the Greco-Roman period, which we can define as being from 600 BC to 201 AD. One of the most prominent people during this time was Hippocrates, who lived 460 to 377 BC. And it was Hippocrates who said that medicine is an art. To the Greeks, to Hippocrates, to his contemporaries, medicine was not a science. Medicine was an art that you practiced. Now, here are 5 characteristics of the Hellenistic period, of the Greek era, that affected the way people looked at anatomy. First of all, it was a very philosophical time, and they had a holistic approach to medicine. They were much more interested, as you can see in number 2, with the whole entire universe and the whole entire person. Now, it's not a bad idea to practice medicine and focus on the whole person, but by doing that to the exclusion of individual parts of the person is a mistake, and it was a huge problem for early anatomy. They did not believe in empirical science. They did not believe in actual observation. They were much more, to the high Greeks, the best use of your time would be to sit around and philosophize and to talk with others of your peers. But you didn't get your hands dirty by going in and doing empirical science, actually doing any dissecting or any examination. And as a result of this, because of this holistic approach, no knowledge of anatomy was considered to be necessary. You didn't need to cut something apart. You were dealing with the whole person. However, they did have some knowledge of sacrifice, probably some of the information that had come down from the Greeks and the mummification process, but also that the priests during this time period, the clerics, were involved in prognostication of examining the future by looking at, say, the entrails of birds that were cut open. And there was a belief that internal anatomy could give you certain omens about things to come. But that was pretty limited in terms of the amount of anatomy that they learned from that. And the most important thing, number 5, was that human dissection was considered to be taboo. And I've always thought this was very interesting, especially in light of the fact that during the latter part of this period, the Romans were happy to throw you into the Colosseum, the arena, and let you be torn apart by beasts as entertainment, but yet it was illegal to dissect a human cadaver for medical purposes. Just those things seem to be, to me, totally incongruous. Now, one of the major, most important players during this Greek period was Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322 BC, during the 4th century BC. Now, he broke with the general flow of Greek philosophy in that he believed that empirical science was important. He accepted the idea of this universal perspective, but he also believed that you needed to get down and dirty and actually look at things. And so as a result, for him, the knowledge of anatomy was necessary, but he still had a taboo on human dissection. And so he dissected other animals. And he was really the original comparative anatomist, if you will, in that in his books and his writings, he writes about not only comparing animals to animals, and vertebrates to invertebrates, but animals to plants. And he looked at the idea that if you take a plant, if you take a tree, for example, that tree has roots down in the ground and it absorbs water, it absorbs nutrients. And then that moves up the trunk of the tree and into the leaves, and then the waste products, which for a tree is oxygen, for one thing, transpire out of the leaves, and it's a one-way street. There's not a circulation in a tree for the most part, and that is that you have nutrients and fluids coming in from the roots and then transpiring out of the leaves. He applied that to what we now call the human circulation, and believed that in us, blood was like the sap of a tree. And in fact, he made that comparison that blood is flowing in one direction. We'll look at that more in just a minute. But the misconceptions that Aristotle had, partially because he didn't dissect humans, he dissected other animals, and he also had these biases, these paradigms that were present during his time period. So here are just some examples. The arteries were actually air tubes. In fact, if you can ask the question, what does the word artery actually mean? I was hired about 3 years ago for 1 year back at Brigham Young University to teach anatomy, to run the human anatomy laboratories as a replacement for a faculty member who had left to take another position. And while they were doing a search to fill that position, I was hired to fill in. The department chairman there was a former student of mine, so he called me and asked me if I would come down and fill that position. So I was talking to these 80 undergraduate TAs in anatomy, and I thought, well, these people already know anatomy. What am I going to teach them that they don't already know? And so I realized that they didn't know the etymology of the terms they were teaching. And so as an example of this, I simply said, what does the word artery mean? And they were all very excited. They all knew that arteries carried blood away from the heart. Great. But what does the original word artery means? It means an air tube. And that just blew them away. Then they started understanding why that would be the case, because I knew some anatomy and a lot of anatomy actually. And I pointed out to them that if you take an animal that has recently died, just within moments, as soon as the animal dies, the heart stops beating, and there's no more blood pushed into the artery. So you can cut an artery right after the animal's died, and it's going to be empty. It's not going to have any blood in it. In fact, it has air in it. So that is consistent with the thinking of the time, that arteries are air tubes. Everyone knows that if you strangle someone, if you cut off their air supply, they're going to die. And what the people during this time period didn't know is that oxygen can be carried by the blood. And so they figured that you had to have these tubes in order for air to get from your lungs to the tissues. And so they must flow through these arteries, these air tubes. Veins, on the other hand, were carrying the blood. And as I've already mentioned, it was a one-way flow, much like you see in a tree. And even today, people talk about having blood in your veins. They don't talk about having blood in your arteries, which is interesting because this is a 3,000-year-old misconception. The heart was not an organ for pumping blood, necessarily. It was the brain, essentially. It was, and in fact, the word phrenic, which refers to the nerves coming to the diaphragm, actually literally means the seat of the mind. And so the heart was considered to be the mind. And that's where you had good feelings. That's where you had love. After all, we send pictures of hearts to to our loved ones for Valentine's Day. We don't send pictures of the hypothalamus in the brain, which we now know has a lot more to do with love than the heart. Try sending a picture of a hypothalamus next Valentine's Day to your loved one and see what kind of reaction you get. Likewise, loyalty is associated with the heart. We put our hand over our chest, over our heart when the flag goes by. In reality, we now know that the temporal lobe is more involved in loyalty. So the next time the flag goes by, try putting your hand to the side of your head and see what kind of reaction you're going to get from the people around you. The liver was the source of bad feelings or bitterness. Bile is bitter, and it actually is, but they thought that you could actually get rid of bitter thoughts by secreting them into the intestine and eliminating them. The spleen was the source of hatred. There's a saying that has gone out of style now, but it was around even when I was young. Of course, that was probably during the Greek period when I was young. That was called venting your spleen. So if you really raged out at someone, you were getting rid of the hatred in your spleen by blowing up. What did the brain do? It was a cooling to the body, as they had learned from the Egyptians, and it was considered to be part of the marrow system. It was connected to the marrow in the bones. And the word for marrow in Latin is medulla, and we have a part of the brain stem. Part of the brain stem is called the medulla oblongata. That it means the long bone marrow. That's what medulla oblongata actually means. So it goes back to this idea that the brain was the central radiator, if you will, of the cooling system of the body, which extended through the marrow, through the backbone. They didn't use the term backbones. They didn't talk about vertebral columns. They talked about the backbone, and they thought that the spinal cord was actually marrow or medulla. Now, during this time period, we did have some progress in anatomy, but interestingly enough, it didn't have any long-term effect. And I'm going to take quite a few of the next few slides from a guy by the name of Sanjib Ghosh from, and I probably slaughtered his name. He's from India at the Medical College in Bengal, India. And he published a paper in 2015 on the history of anatomy, which is very interesting. But he said the development of Greek medicine culminated in the establishment of the School of Greek Medicine in Alexandria, excuse me, in North Africa during the 3rd century BC. In Alexandria, the practice of human cadaver dissection was the dominant means of learning anatomy, and it was here that Herophilus of Chalcedon and his younger contemporary Erasistratus, and I always slaughter that word, of Ceos, became the first ancient Greek physicians to perform systematic dissections on human cadavers in the first half of the 3rd century BC. Herophilus was a Greek physician deemed to be the first anatomist. He was the first scientist to systematically perform scientific dissections of humans. He recorded his findings in over 9 works, which unfortunately for us are now all lost. Celsus, who was in the 1st century medical treatise, and the early Christian author Tertullian state that Herophilus vivisected at least 600 live prisoners. So not only was he involved in dissection like we do today, but he actually cut open living individuals, living people, and probably had a lot of information that would have benefited later generations, but the information didn't make it to them. And the reason is that Alexander the Great, for whom Alexandria is named, he named it after himself, he believed that Alexander was a student of Plato, and he was very, very scholarly. in addition to being very aggressive and militaristic, he wanted to bring all of the great works of his time all together. And he built this gorgeous library in Alexandria for all these books. And most of the books at that time were rolled up scrolls, and they were all deposited there, including the work of Herophilus. Then in a series of fires around 389 AD, Alexandria, and particularly the library, was burned by fanatics who did not believe that science was important, and they didn't believe in, they wanted to get rid of libraries. They didn't believe in learning. They didn't believe in study. And unfortunately, we have some parallels to that even today. But the works of many great writers during this time period were lost in these fires of Alexandria. The end of this period, as you can see, coincides with the death of Galenius, who we refer to simply as Galen, who was born in 130 AD and died in 201 AD. So that his death date is the exact date of the end of the Greek period. And as you can see, for him, I've listed the same exact beliefs as we saw with Aristotle. That is, he believed in empirical science. He believed that anatomy knowledge was necessary, but human dissection was still taboo. As a result, Galen dissected an enormous number of animals, including the great apes, to try to get as close to humans as possible. But as far as we know, never dissected a human, and a lot of his anatomy concepts clearly came from the dissection of other animals. And many of them were incorrect as a result, and so they had to be corrected later on during the medieval period, toward the end of the medieval period. During this time, he and others of the Greek period were very strong proponents of what's called humorism, and that is there were four humors, or four fluids in the body: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. And these became the basis of medicine. So, for example, if you were ill, one of the common beliefs was that you had an imbalance in these four humors. And the biggest problem was, one you could get at least, was blood. They thought that illness was an overproduction, resulted from an overproduction of blood. And so bloodletting became a very common practice. And it's interesting that even though it had this philosophical basis, there was no empirical evidence whatsoever that bloodletting actually did anybody any good. In fact, one could imagine that it was counterproductive. So here's how these four humors interacted with each other and with the world around them. So we have the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. We have four characteristics of hot, dry, wet, and cold. And the humors all interacted with these elements. There's even a larger chart showing that human temperament was associated with these biles. So, for example, blood caused you to be sanguine, which means that you were lethargic. So that's what happened when you were sick. So you had too much blood, so you got rid of it. Now, what we find, this is from a statement from Wikipedia about Galen. Galen may have produced more work than any author in antiquity. It's incredible. So profuse was Galen's output that surviving texts represent nearly half of all the extant literature from ancient Greece. That includes all of the Greek poems and plays. Galen accounts for half of the Greek literature that we have. That's amazing. This painting is by Raphael, and it is the School of Athens. And herein he shows the great scholars of the day, or of history, actually, not just his day. And you can identify quite a few of the people in this painting. But one person that is clearly in the painting, but is not clear which one it is Galen. So one possibility is this guy over on your left that's putting it out his hand, who, in my opinion, is the most likely candidate. But then you have this other kind of blonde-haired, curly-haired guy that's looking down at his tablet on the right. That could also be Galen, but he's in there somewhere. Whether these are my guesses in terms of which characters represent Galen. Now, among Galen's major contributions, and this comes from Wikipedia again, to medicine was his work on the circulatory system. He was the first to recognize that there are distinct differences between venous blood, which is dark, and arterial blood, which is bright red. And we know now that the difference is the presence of oxygen. Oxygen makes hemoglobin bright red. Lack of oxygen makes hemoglobin darker color. Galen believed the circulatory system to consist of two separate one-way systems of distribution rather than a single unified system of circulation, which was presented by William Harvey in the middle of the 16th century. He believed venous blood to be generated in the liver, from where it was distributed and consumed by all organs of the body. He posited that arterial blood originated in the heart, from where it was distributed and consumed by all organs of the body. So you have these two systems. You can see those two systems in his drawing over here to the left. The blood was then regenerated in either the liver or the heart, completing the cycle. And so it was like a tree. It originated at one point, it was a one-way path, and then it transpired out of the tissues, much like the leaves of a tree. Most of his anatomical works have been compiled into various books, such as this one by Charles Singer, The Anatomical Procedures of Galen. And that ends the ends the Greek period at 201 AD with Galen's death, which now brings us to the medieval period from 201 to 253. And we can divide that into the Dark Ages, which roughly 200 AD, actually 201 AD to 900, and then what we call in anatomy the Scholastic period from 900 to 1543 AD. So one of the things that, there's two things that this period is characterized by, and I've shown that here in various pictures from the time. One is that physicians are characterized by showing them looking at flasks of urine. So we have a woodcut on the far left showing a woman who was being examined by the physician who was looking at her urine in a flask. And then in the middle is an illustration from the Canterbury Tales. And this is the physician's tale, and you can tell it's a physician because he has a flask of urine in his hand. And then the other thing that characterized this time period was bloodletting, which is shown over here on the right. And again, if you have an imbalance in the humors, you have too much blood, then you become ill, you become sanguine. And so you need to remove some of the offending blood from the person. And obviously it didn't do anything other than maybe speed up the malaise and the death of the individual. Now, this is from the article by Ghosh again in 2015. For hundreds of years, the European world valued the sanctity of the church more than scientific quest. And it was not until early 14th century that human dissection was revived as a tool for teaching anatomy in Bologna, Italy. Now, as I told you before, I'm a graduate of Brigham Young University, which is a religious school. I personally am a very religious person, but I'm also a scientist. And I look at this statement that today this is still true for a lot of people, that what they learn in church and what they believe is counter to scientific information is a problem. That's what resulted in the fire at Alexandria 1700 years ago, and it's still an issue today. To me, it's not an issue. I've written several books on the relationship between science and religion. You can find those on my website, trentdstevens.com, where I have specifically taken on this issue, specifically in 4 books, in terms of what we understand from science and what we learn from the scriptures. In medieval Europe, considerable advances in the field of science could only be achieved during the 12th and 13th centuries, with the setting up of universities in Paris, in Bologna, in Oxford, in Montpellier, in Padua. As these universities matured, the need for understanding dissection also matured, and particularly culminated in the 14th century. In the middle of the 14th century, we had a huge problem in Europe, well, the whole entire known world at that time, from the plague, the Black Plague, in which it's estimated that 1/5 the population of the old world died because of the plague. And the diseases were then later brought to the New World, where various plagues killed a huge number of people here. From the 12th century onwards, the church did not forbid human dissection in general. However, certain edicts were directed at specific practices. One of the significant proscriptions that Pope Alexander III enunciated at the Council of Tours in France in 1163 was the prohibition of clerics to involve themselves in the studies of the physical nature. And the canon directive was named as Ecclesia Abhorrent a Sanguine. Now, sanguine means blood. So the translation of this is the church abhors blood. This was misinterpreted as a ban which prevented clerics from practicing surgery or studying anatomy. Now, it's important to recognize that during this time period, for several hundred years, the new universities that were being established were being populated. The teachers there, the professors, the doctors, were clerics, were monks, and they had a very strong religious foundation, and religion was a very big part of their paradigms, their philosophies. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II took significant measures towards the progress of science, which reflected his free-thinking outlook. In 1231, he issued a decree which mandated that a human body should be dissected at least once in every 5 years. So a 5-year cycle, at some point during a medical student's education, he would be able to see the dissection of a cadaver for anatomical studies. An attendance was made compulsory for anyone who was to practice medicine or surgery. So you were required at some time during your medical education to attend one of these dissections. And I'll show some more of these. This was part of the charters of the various universities that were set up. And we'll talk a little bit more later about some of those. But this is the earliest we have indication that it was recognized that anatomical dissection was critical to medical education. Mondino di Luzzi produced the first known anatomy textbook based on human dissections. And you can see that this is going into the early part of the 14th century. Now, here we have that drawing of that physician. We can see him holding the flask of urine. And we then go to the bloodletting drawing that I showed before. And then over on your left is a diagram of where to draw blood for various maladies that may be affecting you. So it became a very specific philosophical approach without any real medical foundation. There's no empirical basis for it whatsoever. It was all philosophical and actually, for most counterproductive. Now, what I find very interesting here is that here's the digestive tract. They didn't have a very good idea of the internal anatomy either, because you can see, for example, there's no stomach over here. Whatever this thing is coming out of probably the two different parts of the origin from Galen's perspective, and that is the liver and the heart for two different branches of the blood flow. And then you have the intestines hooking right into the urinary bladder. So very poor understanding of anatomy. Now here we have going into the 15th, early 16th century now, you still have a painting of a physician, and you can see that he's a physician because he has a flask containing urine. And you can see that this lady that he's visiting is quite sanguine. And so he's trying to diagnose her problem. And one of the things that came out of this time period is that the concept of diabetes came from sampling the urine. And it turns out that diabetes mellitus means that you have sweet urine. Now, how do you know, how in the world did the physician know that you had sweet urine? There weren't any specific empirical tests for sugar in the urine other than sticking your finger in the urine and tasting it. So I never became a medical doctor myself, even though I attended medical school. I was never interested in medicine per se. I was interested in anatomy and developmental biology, and that's why I have a PhD in these fields. One of the reasons that I never wanted to go into medicine is I don't like sick people, and I don't like body fluids, and I'm not interested in sticking my finger into somebody's urine. Now, during this time period, physicians carried around with them what were called boot books. They had these long writing boots, and they had these books that were stuck into the writing boots that were their basically their medical library. Well, what were these boot books? So we can see that one of them would have been the anatomical writings of Galen. There were a lot of errors. In fact, I just noticed that on the front cover of this book by Galen is a bunch of early anatomists dissecting what looks like a pig, as opposed to dissecting a human. The other one was the writings of Hippocrates. So here we have a Renaissance physician. We can see the long boots, and you can see that tucked into those boots would have been the writings of Galen and the writings of Hippocrates, which would have been the physician's library at the time. Now, also at this time, in about 1500 AD, we have the anatomy classroom. And this is a classic drawing from the time period. This is the great anatomist Mondino Luzzi. Luzzi, you remember being the person who wrote the first anatomy textbook. This is by Johann Catham, who did this painting. And we have a number of people here. So we have to begin with a professor who is sitting at the dais, and he's not actually looking at the cadaver. In order to become a professor of anatomy, you had to have memorized Galen to the point where you could recite it. And notice that this professor, Luzzi, is looking straight forward, and he's not reading the book in front of him. He may have Galen out in front of him, or even his own book in front of him, but he's not reading from it. He's reciting, and that was what you did in order to become a professor. Then you have down here a person's who's called the barber surgeon. And unlike today, where surgeons are at the higher end of the medical profession, these guys were at the bottom end of the medical profession. And we would call them today a preceptor. And I actually, when I was at BYU as an interim faculty member down there for 1 year, I was in charge of directing the preceptors that were working on the cadavers. And so the barber surgeon, this guy could cut your hair if you needed it cut, and he could also let blood if you needed that done. So we then have the classic barber pole, this striped barber pole that has red and white stripes, the white referring to your hair, the red referring to your blood. So this is the combined profession of this guy. And then we have the guy with a pointer here called the ostensor. Today we would call him a TA, or a teaching assistant. And he's the one who, as the professor is reading the structures out of Galen, usually Galen, then the ostensor is pointing these out. So this is the nature of the anatomy classes. And I find it really interesting that the anatomy students here don't seem to be all that interested in what's going on. They seem to be talking to each other about the party they're going to have that night or something else. That all changed in 1543 with the publication of the book The Fabrica by Andreas Vesalius. Now, the Fabrica, that simply means the fabric. It's Latin for the fabric of the body, or the tissues, if you will, is really what the book would be called. And this is a drawing from the book of Andreas Vesalius, probably done at about 1542 when he was 28 years old. He was the ostensor. He was a barber surgeon. He became an ostensor. He passed the exam to become a professor. But when he did so, he came down from the dais. He fired the ostensor and the barber surgeon, and he started doing the dissections himself. And so that changed anatomy permanently and ushered in the modern era of anatomy, where you have the professor now getting down, or directly involved in empirical studies of anatomy, and not just reading from Galen and accepting what somebody else had to say. These are some of the gorgeous illustrations from Vesalius's book. You can see how anatomically accurate they are. However, even as beautiful as these drawings are, there's still some inaccuracies. And those came from the fact that the artist, who was a student in the Titan School of Art, had taken anatomy himself and drew images according to some of Galen's misconceptions, including looking at the sternum and thinking that there were sternobrae in the adult sternum, and there are not. So he had more divisions in the sternum. The liver still had 7 lobes instead of 4. There were some other illustration errors. Now, in the background is the countryside around Padua, where Vesalius taught, and these. This is where Vesalius and others went to acquire cadavers for teaching anatomy during this time period. So here we have an illustration showing Vesalius undertaking an anatomical lecture in Padua. A notable shift in the prevalent trend in medieval Italy is he is dissecting the human body himself. He is referring to Galen's text, which you can see that prevalent textbook of anatomy in those days, which is open by the side of the cadaver. You can see that over to your left. So he's referring to Galen, but then he is disagreeing with some of what Galen is saying. Vesalius is surrounded by his students. Notice they're a lot more interested than the ones in the previous pictures of Lucy's lectures. In Padua, and the general public viewing the dissection from the gallery. So a lot of these dissection suites were large affairs with a lot of places for people to stand and lean against these wooden railings for showing anatomical dissections. And I have a picture of that later. The beginning of modern medicine can then be dated to the day in 1536 when Vesalius, walking outside the city walls of Louvain, came across the body of an executed criminal chained to a gibbet. Now, this was a common practice in medieval Europe. When you executed someone, you would hang them on the main road coming into town, showing people this is what happens if you break the law here. So it was a warning to people, and so these cadavers were on display there. Only the bones remained, held together by ligaments alone, according to Vesalius. He at once made off with the arms and legs, which he hid under his cloak, and came back, went in through the city gate, came back that night, defying the curfew. And what happens is that the gates of the city, in the city walls, were closed at night. And so Vesalius had to stay out all night long, and pretty much in hiding. Because if you were outside of the city at night, you were considered literally an outlaw, meaning you were outside of the laws that were practiced within the city. To climb the gibbet, smash the chain, and carry off the trunk. Out of these parts, he constructed his first skeleton. You can see a skeleton in the picture over to your left. Emboiling them up secretly, and then pretending that he had brought them with him from Paris. I was burning with so great a desire to possess these bones, he wrote 7 years later, that I did not hesitate to snatch in the middle of the night that which I so desired. Now, when I was taking anatomy, and for quite a while thereafter, there was a practice to have one bone in a black bag, in which you then inserted your hand into the bag. You had to feel the bone, and you had to name the bone from feeling it and tell which side of the body it came from. So you had to say, this is a left humerus, for example. And this practice goes all the way back to Galen, Vesalius, who was having his students go out at night to bring in other bones for other skeletons that they reconstructed. I never did do that in my own anatomy classes, but maybe I shortchanged my students by not having them do this. Now here's some other drawings from around the same time period. This is Nero with the autopsy of his wife. And you can see, even though it's supposed to be Nero, the painting is from 1410. So the anatomical drawing would be from that time period. So here's a 15th century anatomy lesson. And you can see that the professor is down off the dais at this point, but still not doing the dissections himself. Now here's an example of that kind of anatomy suite that I was talking about, where the public could stand around the railing and watch the dissection. This one is showing a kind of a comparative anatomy lab with skeletons of a whole bunch of other animals, and then a human dissection going on down at the bottom. Not necessarily a dissection, just actually probably a demonstration at this point. This is from 1610. Here's another example of a similar kind of dissection. This is from 1596 from the Netherlands. This one I always thought was kind of funny. It's not during that time period. It's a much later drawing by Hogarth, which is entitled The Anatomy Lesson, but it's also the consequences of sin. So here you have this cadaver, and at this time, cadavers were from convicted felons. So if you were a murderer. If you killed, say, one person, you were hanged. But if you killed several people, or if your murder was particularly heinous, the judge could order that you be executed, and then your body turned over to the anatomist for dissection. In fact, that's how anatomists obtained their bodies during this time period. And so Hogarth is using this as a metaphor for the consequences of sin. You can see the guy, some organ is down there on the bottom with a dog chewing on it, and you have, even though this is now out of fashion by the 18th century, you have the professor Ostenser doing the pointing out, and you have a barber surgeon down there chopping away. You have bones boiling over in a pot on the side. So this is very much an 18th century metaphorical drawing. Now, this is from the Renaissance. This is an art lesson by Pazzarotti. And what you see here is that in addition to the medical schools having dissections, the art schools also were dissecting cadavers. And that's why the artist that did the illustrations for Vesalius's work disagreed with him, because he had actually attended dissections himself. And that's one of the reasons the anatomical dissections were so incredibly accurate during this time. So I'm going to show you a few other pictures of art and anatomy. This is an 11th century drawing. Here's an early Arabic drawing. This is from Provence in the 13th century. This one's kind of interesting because this is fairly accurate in terms of the nervous system. This is a Persian drawing from the 14th century. And then here's one from the 15th century showing female maladies. And you can see that, for example, here's the uterus. So over here, instead of being over here in the midline, the kidneys are way out here on the hips and turned the wrong direction. Then here's a contemporary of that. Now, isn't that interesting? These are both from the 15th century. This one is totally anatomically accurate. Here's the liver, here's the spleen, here's the urinary bladder, vagina, and etc. And this is by the great artist Leonardo da Vinci. Interestingly enough, da Vinci's drawings, even though they were so gorgeous, it had almost no effect on, or no impact on the history of anatomy. His drawings were kept secret. They were not revealed until after his death, and they still, and it was a long time after that, they still don't have any real impact on the history of anatomy. Here are some of the pictures from his notes. Now, look at how incredible the skeleton is. And his notes were all very cryptic and in fact written backwards, so that they couldn't be deciphered very easily. Here's a porcelain cadaver that's actually pregnant. You can see the little fetus, where my point go? You can see the little fetus right here in the uterus. So there's a front wall to this porcelain cadaver that can be removed. A lot of these things are pretty small. I've seen models of these in museums, and some of them are only 6 inches tall, but incredibly detailed, very accurate. Here are some of my favorite Renaissance paintings. This is Tulp's Anatomy Lesson by Rembrandt. And these are the ones that I personally interacted with almost on a daily basis. This is the Gross Clinic by Thomas Eakins. This is hanging in the Thomas Jefferson Medical School in Philadelphia. One of my advisors when I was working on my PhD was at Jefferson. And so I went over there probably once a week, walked right by this great big huge painting by Thomas Eakins. It's probably, I don't know, 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, something like that. And then every single day, as I went to the University of Pennsylvania, walking into the gigantic rotundum entrance to the medical school at the University of Pennsylvania, I walked right past this painting, which is the Gross Clinic by Thomas Eakins. And this painting, again, is huge. It's probably 12 by 6 feet. Hangs on the wall at the University of Pennsylvania, or at least it did when I was there. I haven't been back in years. And then you would turn right and go down the hallway, and along the hall leading to the lab where I worked were paintings of all of the past great anatomists at the University of Pennsylvania. The University of Pennsylvania was the very first medical school in the United States. It was established in 1765 by Benjamin Franklin. And so I have the honor of graduating from the oldest medical school in the United States. So here's a little bit of the history of cadavers, the obtaining of cadavers. So we saw that as early as the 13th century, cadavers were being mandated for medical schools. Here this is looking at mostly England and the US. In 1505, the Guild of Surgeons and Barbers in Edinburgh were allowed 1 cadaver per year. In 1540, the London Guild of Surgeons and Barbers, notice the barbers are still a part of this story, they had 4 cadavers per year for the college. In 1663, the College of Physicians in London had 6. In 1647, here in the American colonies, 1 cadaver was allowed for the medical school for medical practice. And then you saw that the University of Pennsylvania was 100 years later, 1 every 4 years. In 1784, there was only 1 medical school. By 1823, there were 8 medical schools in the United States, and executions were not keeping pace with the demand for cadavers. This was a problem worldwide, or at least throughout Europe and the Americas at the time, because, as I said, executed criminals were given over to the anatomist as an extra punishment. And this was the only source of these cadavers on this list. So William Shippen, who was professor of anatomy at the University of Pennsylvania, and his is one of the portraits hanging in the hallway, the hallowed halls of the medical school. It said this is 11th of January, 1770. And he says, many of the inhabitants of this city, I hear, have been much terrified by sundry wicked and malicious reports of my taking up bodies from the several burying grounds in this place. Notwithstanding, these facts are groundless, the reports false. Yet humanity obliges me to suppress all feelings of resentment and contempt, and do all in my power to remove these, though groundless fears, which I do by declaring in the most solemn manner that I never had, and that I never will have, directly or indirectly, one subject from the burying ground belonging to any denomination of Christians whatsoever. Now, there's a loophole here that Shippen isn't really explaining. And that is, he's not digging up Christian burying grounds, but that still leaves Jewish burying grounds and what's called potter's fields, which are burying grounds for people who you don't know what the religion is, kind of indigents. I have persevered in teaching this difficult and most useful branch of medicine, medical knowledge, though attended with very disagreeable circumstances. And the disagreeable circumstances that he's writing on the 11th of January is the night before a mob attacked his house and threw bricks, breaking out several of the windows in his house. Chiefly from the motive of public good, and have and always will preserve the utmost decency with regard to the dead, and do again solemnly protest that none of your house or kindred shall ever be disturbed in their silent graves by me or any under my care. W. Shippen Jr., Professor of Anatomy. It's also interesting that if you visit Boston and go to Benjamin Franklin's house, you'll find that during later excavations of Ben Franklin's house, several skeletons were found in his basement because he actually had a professor of anatomy who was staying with him and teaching anatomy out of Ben Franklin's house, and apparently disposing of the cadavers after he was finished by sticking them down in the basement. This is, I'm not going to read this one, but this is a letter from George Washington to William Shippen, the same one we just read from before. He was the Surgeon General of the Continental Army at the time, and this is talking about a an epidemic of smallpox, which they were experiencing, that Shippen was being asked about. This is written in Morristown, Pennsylvania in 1777. Now, the lack of cadavers for teaching anatomy led to what's referred to as grave robbing, and these guys were referred to as, the guys shown in this picture were referred to as sack 'em up men or resurrectionists, who were digging up cadavers and then selling them to the medical schools or individual medical students. In Paris, there was a big problem. This is the Port Neuf, between the South Bank and the city island, where Notre Dame is located. And tourists were warned not to hang around this bridge at night because the medical students in Paris were using that area to procure cadavers for the dissection. So if I were an anatomist at the University of Paris back in these days, I would say, well, next Monday, we're going to start dissecting cadavers, and it's required of you that you have to furnish your own cadaver. So apparently some of these cadavers that ended up in the University of Paris had been walking around as tourists the day before. So here's, oh, I'm sorry, this is the Port Neuf is on the north side, on the north bank, not the south bank. Between the city island, where you can see Notre Dame and Conciergerie, which is the prison where people were kept before they were executed by guillotine during the French Revolution. Now we come to a very interesting story of William Hare and William Burke in Edinburgh, Scotland. It's important to understand, and people who write this history point out that Burke and Hare were actually not Scottish, they were actually Irish, and apparently to people who care, that was a very big distinction. They were Irishmen living in Edinburgh, not Scotsmen. So on December 25th, this is Christmas Day, 1827, an old pensioner dies in Hare's boarding house. Now, boarding house sounds kind of grandiose, but it was just a house where Hare rented out a couple of rooms. And so that constituted a boarding house. The problem is that Hare was responsible for this guy's burial, being the owner of the boarding house and this guy not having any next of kin. Not only that, the pensioner owed a month's back rent to Hare. So Hare, by asking around, found out that Dr. Knox at the University of Edinburgh was paying for cadavers. So he hauled this old pensioner's body off, and Dr. Knox paid him £7 10 shillings for the body. And then he made a very profound statement. He said he'd pay more if the body had been fresh. Hare apparently had waited a few days before he hauled the body down there. So this hatched what you might call a harebrained idea, and maybe that's where the term harebrained came from. But during the next 10 months, William Hare and William Burke suffocated 15 people and hauled them off to Dr. Knox, selling them for somewhere between 8 and 14 pounds. This is more money than either one of these guys would be making in over a month's worth of work. So they were very prosperous over the next year. They actually bought a new house with some of their ill-gained money. They were arrested, and I'm not making any of this up. They were arrested on Halloween night in 1828. So if you want to dress up in a real heinous costumes, you need to dress up like Burke and Hare. And actually, if you go to London to Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, you can actually see these two characters in the basement of a wax museum where she exhibits some infamous murderers. And I didn't make this up either. The trial was held that year on Christmas Day. It was a one-day trial, didn't last very long. Hare turned King's evidence, which here in the United States would be called state's evidence, and he blamed Burke for all the murders. Burke was then hanged a month and 3 days later, 28th of January, 1829. So justice was very swift back in those days. Then, as further punishment, Burke's body was donated to the University of Edinburgh Anatomy Department and dissected. And there it remains today. So that's a photograph of the skeleton of William Burke in the University of Edinburgh Anatomy Museum. Now, that's not the rest of the end of the story. This is actually from the Idaho State Journal in September 1988. And this says that a calling card case from a murderer's skin, this is the murderer being William Burke, brings $1,785 at an English auction. And what the story says is that this was purchased by a person whose business is to take people around to the sites of infamous murders, and he has his calling card pouch, a pouch made from the leather of William Burke's skin. Now, the process of embalming, one of the problems before the Civil War was that these cadavers were not embalmed, so you had to do your dissections very quickly, and usually it was done in the winter time, and oftentimes kind of semi-outdoors, like in a barn or some other type facility. But during the Civil War, because especially Union soldiers who were the sons or husbands of wealthy people needed to be shipped back to the North, they started using things like arsenic and zinc chloride to preserve the deceased people. They actually would also put them in barrels of wine, put them on ice or other means to preserve them, and then send them by train back north for burial by their loved ones. And one of the reasons that the Union won the Civil War is they had 5 times as much rail lines as did the South, and they could afford to send the deceased wealthy Union soldiers back north for burial. Now, because of the Burke and Hare episode in August of 1832 in Edinburgh, and then followed the next year in England, was an act for regulating schools of anatomy. And this actually, for the first time in history, made it legal for medical schools to obtain cadavers for dissection purposes. And in the United States, the first anatomy law was enacted in 1869 in Maine. And because I live in Idaho, I found it interesting that it was 100 years later that the first Anatomy Act was enacted in the state of Idaho to regulate and allow the dissection of cadavers. Idaho State University obtained our first cadaver in 1972 under the work of Dr. Rodney Seeley, who was my co-author on our anatomy and physiology textbooks. And so when I came in 1981, we already had a 9-year history of using cadavers at Idaho State University. These were for undergraduate courses because we had no medical or dental school at the time. I was hired here in 1981 when the dental school was first established, or the Idaho Dental Education Program. When we first published our books of anatomy and physiology, a publishing company did a survey and found that only 5% of undergraduate courses were actually using cadavers. 95% then, and certainly probably still are, using models and other material for teaching anatomy. Now, just the final touch on the history of anatomy. This is from a newspaper, the Idaho State Journal again, in 1994. And this is a the announcement of Joseph Jernigan, who was 39 and was executed in Texas as a result of murdering a 75-year-old man during a burglary. And his body was donated to medical science and was shipped to the University of Chicago, where it was sectioned, as you can see in the bottom right box that I've made, into 1 millimeter thick sections, and there were 1,870 sections in total. And because of the computer technology in 1995, I think it says that it would take the equivalent of 30 typical personal computers to store the images. Now, anybody can store that whole entire cadaver. It's a digital cadaver. Once it was sectioned, then it was reconstructed from those sections. The first ones that came out in the 1990s, I tried to use for teaching anatomy. They looked like they'd been cut out of styrofoam. But as the years passed, they became better and better. So for the past 15 years or so, I've used excellent illustrations from this series, which is called The Visible Human. And you can see the beautiful anatomical detail from Jernigan's body. And that is the end of the first lecture. So thank you. And I will turn off the recording. Oops.